there still just remains this challenge of what am I supposed to do that isn't going to land me on the front page of The Guardian in a negative article,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and because there is, we're starting to see some good progress, right? The EU has clarified a percentage of credits that will be able to come from international markets. That's really positive progress in terms of setting a signal that this is possible, that it can be endorsed, that there's a role for these units to play.
Hmm.
SBTI has made a huge amount of progress in the last few weeks. I'm still kind of digesting it, but I think um, it's one of the areas that's really interesting to think about in terms of clarity over how different activities might be able to fit within company strategies, company mitigation and decarbonization strategies.
Hmm.
Um, and so and then there's a number of other financing vehicles that I think are becoming more interesting. Things like green bonds, things like debt for nature swaps, or debt for climate impact swaps.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. And I'm stepping in for Eddie today, who's taking a well-earned Thanksgiving break. Now, Naomi, welcome to the pod. It's a pleasure to have you
Thank you.
on. Happy Thanksgiving. I know it's a little contentious holiday, but it is a uniquely American one. But there's some elements around Thanksgiving that I quite like. Certainly the element of gratitude. I've got a lot to be thankful for on a personal and professional level. Uh, I'm grateful for my health and my family, as well as building out a really wonderful team. What are you most thankful for?
I don't know, for one day at a time, for every
One
tree
day at a
that
time?
still stands, for the family that somehow is resilient in the face of a whole lot going on. So, yeah,
Good,
I'm
good.
definitely one who views this holiday from a slightly problematic perspective, or finds the holiday slightly problematic. But yeah, I can still get on board with giving
Things
thanks.
are gonna Yeah, I think let's focus on the good things. I think that might be a bit of an intro to the conversation for today. Noam, it's a pleasure to have
Indeed.
you on. You're a person that I deeply admire in this market. You've been in this space for quite a long time, and you are one of the foremost experts with regards to nature-based solutions. I'm really keen to get your thoughts on just the status and sort of the market, effectively where we are today. But maybe as a jumping off point, we've just closed out 2 weeks of COP in Belém, what was supposed to be the forest COP. And there were some interesting headlines. There was a fire at COP that certainly grabbed a lot of the news. And it was just another one of these predictable years, right? Another year without the fossil fuel phase out being structured into the wording. But there were still some meaningful developments. Forests were obviously front and center, both symbolically and in terms of negotiations. There was an adaptation finance sort of modest bump, but I'm always pessimistic around the commitments that are made at these conferences because they don't tend to be realized when it actually comes to the date when the developed nations actually put up the cash. They tend not to, or the weasel out of it. But then equity and indigenous rights and nature-based solutions got more visibility than ever before at COP. I'd love to just get your thoughts on takeaways from COP itself, if and also ask you to give the audience a little bit of background around your journey. So, give you the choice. Where do you want to begin?
Sure. Yeah, well, let's begin where the story begins. I suppose I can give a very quick background and then jump into COP.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing. I always joke that I got into this market because I met a guy at a bar, which is actually a true story.
Really? That's
But
the best opening
I
story of all. I love it. I want to double click that.
fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to it, right? But I grew up in the forest and I spent most of my childhood running around in natural areas near Portland, Oregon. And
Mhm.
I think, nature just was a very much a part of me. I still view all of us as humans as part of nature, and that connection is just really strong for me. So it's been a joy to spend a lot of my career focused on that. And so, yeah, I had started at Conservation International, working on a program that was looking at the impact of protected areas on Indigenous peoples. Obviously, very relevant, right? And it was the very early days, so we were actually to the broader team doing some of the prep work that CI was doing for the Bali COP. When REDD was really, first articulated in the UN
Hmm.
framework. So I wasn't super involved in that, but enough to gain a lot of understanding of what was happening in the space and what REDD was about, and how some of the conservation organizations were looking at it as a big financial opportunity.
Hmm.
And then I moved to Thailand, and I met a guy in a bar. Um, that guy happened to be Ingo Pool,
Oh,
from South Pole.
I was about to guess.
So
Okay, that's great. I
I
caught up
should have
with him.
made
I
you
caught up.
guess, darn
I
it.
Yeah, I should have yes. But I caught up with Ingo just recently in not in Thailand, but actually in Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, just recently at a conference, and he's one of the
Nice.
characters of this market.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah. So we met because our spouses at the time were working together, and it was like a drinks event for their company, and then
Hmm.
got to talking. And yeah, I ended up doing some work for South Pole, and then yeah, ended up
Great.
going from there to VCS. But yeah, so I've been in this space for about 20 years, and led a lot of Verra's VCS at the time. Work around nature-based solutions. So helping to develop the program around REDD, leading the work on incorporating lots of different activities into it, building the first jurisdictional REDD framework, and then the updates, kicking off the updates that are now underway. So, but
Hmm.
I've
So,
also worked
so the
again on the
transition
project
from
side.
the older methodology to the new
Yeah,
consolidated methodology.
yeah,
Interesting.
exactly.
Love to get some insights from you on how you perceive the work is going and the adoption in the market more broadly.
Y- Yeah, for sure. Let's come back to that. So,
Yeah.
yeah, anyway, in terms of COP, I think that this has been a really interesting one in terms of putting forests at the center.
Hmm.
It did get more attention than we've ever seen before. And yet, obviously, it was kind of more of the same, a lot of, not quite reaching where we had hoped to be. I'm not surprised on the fossil fuel phase out component. And I think, unfortunately, that ended up dragging down the possibility for a forest commitment because they were kind of linked in the negotiations.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I think we have to realize that it's a very challenging thing to reach agreement on a fossil fuel phase out from a supply side perspective, right? In reality, not that I'm letting oil companies off the hook far from it, but they will keep producing as long as it is in demand, right?
Yeah,
And
completely agree.
with growing economies around the world, the increase in
And growing
demand for
energy
oil-based
demand.
products is growing,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And so I really think that it needs to be addressed from the supply side to a large extent. And of course, regulation around energy mix and things like that. So hopefully we will see more ambition on that in future COPs. But what we did see was, at the last minute, most countries did end up submitting their NDCs, and those NDCs did increase in ambition to some extent.
Hmm.
And what we've seen is that the EU and China have met, and in China's case, exceeded the commitments that they've made previously. So I think there's an undervaluing of the progress that was made from COP on the NDC front. And of course, the NDC front, where addressing energy within those economies is a part of the NDC, in which in most cases it is, that is addressing the demand side factor of this. So I don't think it's entirely a failure, but also I think the biggest takeaway for me at this COP is that the action is happening outside of it,
Hmm.
right? The other thing that we saw was a lot of agreements and continuation commitments to continue certain conversations in other venues. So you've got TFFF that didn't get enough finance. That's the mechanism around deforestation. Um, there is obviously a real miss in terms of the amount of finance that was committed to that, but that will continue. There was a coalition around jurisdictional REDD, which was agreed and will continue in parallel. So there's been a lot of these spin-offs on a lot of different issues. And I think in some ways that's an indication that we have more momentum now beyond the walls of COP. And I view that as actually a positive thing in
Yeah.
some ways, although it's also a negative reflection on the ability of COP to actually produce outcomes.
Yeah, can I give an opinion on that last bit as well? I completely agree with everything you said. I think, yeah, I like the fact that there are now different forums for different conversations to be had, and progress to be made. I think it's reflective of just how hard it is to build consensus in this multilateral context. You've got 192 nations effectively coming together. There's always going to be division. You can hardly get consensus, even in a room with 10 people. Now you multiply that significantly. It's just hard. And so those conversations in those side sort of rooms, let's just call it, allow for there to be consensus building and effectively work in progress to be done without the kind of noise that happens in the big circus. And so I'm hopeful that
Absolutely.
you get a little bit more progress in that context. Thanks for giving that background on COP. I like the positive spin that you take on that, viewing certainly the NDC's progress. Honestly, that's not been something that's been adequately reported, I don't think, in the media, and I think that deserves and warrants more sort of view. But how do you actually see the governments, looking at at this? They're making these commitments, but how do you think they're tracking? Because when I look at the climate active tracker, it's not looking great in terms of grades.
Yeah, I mean, I put a positive spin on it because I think that there has been progress on that front that hasn't gotten enough attention.
Hmm.
But that said, I think the broader problem is that what's become really clear, and Europe is making progress towards NDCs, China is making progress. It's nowhere near enough. Like we know that,
Hmm.
right? The current commitments are not getting us anywhere near what we need. Maybe we're able to track down to 2.5 degrees change, which is still incredibly catastrophic, most likely. And so I think the problem at the end of the day, and I'm going to start sounding a bit out of left field, is that, the overall problem is capitalism. And I, of course, am saying that from within a market that I do believe can work when it's designed properly. And yet,
Hmm.
in general, countries and companies are not willing to sacrifice growth in the pursuit of an economic value. We still just have a classic problem of a tragedy of the commons, where without better regulation, because there aren't a lot of teeth in the Paris Agreement,
Hmm.
because there isn't something that's really like forcing a broader step in the right direction. Countries continue to make decisions on a policy level that are made for economic reasons and are not optimized for, the climate outcomes that we need to see. So I don't know how we change that, honestly. I have to say that I slide into expecting us to get to geoengineering solutions that probably won't go very well. Not to say that it's time to give up. I think it's more time to double down.
Agree. And it is that paradox essentially, right? That we're stuck within the constructs of this capitalistic model. But it does, and I think that there are echoes of that lack of enforcement and lack of penalties, for example, for non-compliance in other related systems. When I look at Corsia right now, we're doing some work for some clients in that space, and there's a question of why are the airlines waiting to participate when they're already halfway through the first phase of their compliance window, and there are multiple answers to that question. But one of them is that there's no teeth, there's no penalties for non-compliance that are prevalent or readily available. And without that stick, that most of the airlines will just remain in a holding pattern. And it just comes down to risk aversion and just, they're not mandated to until the last minute effectively. And so people just wait. And I think it's that sort of thing, right? That's happening as well. When I look at the IEA estimates, there's been a revision there, and there's a continuous growth in energy demand more broadly, as you mentioned earlier, and that's certainly not helping to bend the curve. And I do see that there's positive signs with regards to renewables, but there's still just such a voracious appetite for energy, especially in the AI economy that we're in right
Exactly.
now. And I think that, to your point, it's that supply side is just basically following the capitalistic model, which is to service the client base. And if there's demand, there's going to be supply. So
And
we're
shareholder
in.
value above everything else, right?
Yeah.
But I also think that there has just been a lack of clarity. And this is something
Hmm.
that probably cuts through everything we talk about today, because
Hmm.
I think on the demand front, the demand front of carbon markets, there still just remains this challenge of what am I supposed to do that isn't going to land me on the front page of The Guardian in a negative article,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
And because there is, we're starting to see some good progress, right? The EU has clarified a percentage of credits that will be able to come from international markets. That's really positive progress in terms of setting a signal that this is possible, that it can be endorsed, that there's a role for these units to play. SBTI has made a huge amount of progress in the last few weeks. I'm still kind of digesting it, but I think it's one of the areas that's really interesting to think about in terms of clarity over how different activities might be able to fit within company strategies, company mitigation and decarbonization strategies. And so and then there's a number of other financing vehicles that I think are becoming more interesting. Things like green bonds, things like debt for nature swaps, or debt for climate impact swaps, that are going to be interesting to track. And yet then you have a lot of confusion still over how all of that's going to knit up and what the right sort of combination of strategies is for a company that is going to leave them in a better position, that incorporates this overall into their value chain, that it recognizes climate risk to the company and really puts this, not just in a CSR category, but rather in a central category to the company's sustainability as a business. But there's just been a huge lack of clarity around all of these things that I think has left most companies going, well, I'm safer not doing anything than to take risks at this point in time.
Yeah. And I think I'm with you on that. I think we need to give, reasons to participate in this market as opposed to reasons not to. Right. Can I come back? So thank you for that. That was great insights. Can we come back to the REDD Plus piece? I'd love to just understand from your perspective, being one of the chief architects in our market, how you're seeing the REDD Plus evolution overall, right? You mentioned your work when you were at Verra on the transition from VM 0007 to VM 48. The consolidated methodology. Can you give us a little bit of context and background in terms of, just for the audience who may not be familiar, in terms of why that was necessary and how you're seeing the evolution of that? And then I'd like to come back to the jurisdictional REDD piece, because you talked about JNR and then some progress obviously at COP around jurisdictional REDD. There's always intersection between jurisdictional and project-based, and so I'd like to also
there should be
not avoid that and get your thoughts on that. So can you give some context,
sure. And just before diving into that, to clarify that I am an independent consultant now and not an employee of Verra, so everything that I'm saying here is my own personal perspective. So that evolution, and it wasn't just VM7, right? There are a number of different REDD methodologies, but the theory, Verra started working on updates to that quite a number of years ago, actually. We started working on jurisdictional REDD something like 2010, 2012, of really just getting started on how is this going to sit within jurisdictional accounting? Can we provide a means of accounting at a jurisdictional scale that could be market linked? And once that was out, it was starting to become clear that there were some interesting results that were coming from some of the projects. And we'd been at that point, 10, 15 years into project experience. And so there had been a lot of lessons learned. And the original approach was to put out a consolidation of the methodologies. It was essentially to remove some inconsistencies between the different methodologies and condense into one way of determining a reference area, which was used in the old methodologies to determine the project baseline. And that was put out to public comment. And the comments that came back were very strongly in favor of saying, this is not the direction that we should be going. We should be going in the direction of nested architecture. In other words, how is the jurisdictional system and the project system going to interact? And how do we actually make sure that those things are integrated in accounting? And so Verra, taking on that feedback, taking on some of the scientific assessments and impact assessments that had come forward, was to switch that into an approach of looking at jurisdictional scale accounting and how could that be then allocated around a jurisdiction. And so VM 48 looks at the historical deforestation across an entire jurisdiction, and then you essentially uses a risk map of where that deforestation might occur to allocate out a portion of deforestation that will be expected in any given location around the jurisdiction. And that was all very much driven by this understanding that we needed to align with and incorporate the results that were happening at a jurisdictional scale, because a lot of the momentum was starting to swing in that direction of making sure that it was possible to support countries and that countries had in place all of the mechanisms that they would need in order to account and report at a jurisdictional scale. And obviously, projects needed to be consistent with that to make sure that everything sort of added up, if I can put it that way, at a
Yeah.
national level.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, in terms of progress, I think things are going well at this point, and plenty of people would laugh at that statement in terms of timing, I suppose. But things are, as far as I can see them now, on a good track in terms of being able to produce the data that's needed
Hmm.
and deliver the data that's needed to projects. With some other elements underway in terms of bringing in specific activities that couldn't be covered in the first round. So things like peatlands and handling some specific elements of projects where there is some sustainable forest management involved. So, sort of adding on the other elements of this that are needed for certain specific project types. Um, and I still think it was the right direction given the context, right? I think it's the
Hmm.
right shift that had to happen in order to ensure that things were making sense at a jurisdictional scale. I think what's interesting now is that in the period of time that it's taken to go from the old methodologies to VM48 to producing the data, there's also been a massive shift in the technology that's available and will be available in the next 5, 10 years that completely revolutionizes what's possible in terms of forest accounting, in terms of the data from the ground, in terms of direct biomass measurement. There's a lot happening with direct flux measurement, which is interesting. And so there's this massive kind of revolution in what's possible on the DMRV front that provides a huge opportunity, but also in some ways complicates things, how these can be incorporated quickly, how they can be incorporated with rigor, and that are able to produce results with strong enough certainty and accuracy to be able to account for these activities. So it's a really dynamic space at the moment
Hmm.
of that rapid change potentially having implications for how things will be accounted for in the future and how some new standards are looking at doing things.
Yeah, that's an awesome summary. So thank you for that. I'm just curious, from a market's perspective, and you kind of talked about this, right, around the timing piece, and also the lack of clarity throughout, is sort of pervasive around just not our market, but every market and just in society in general. But if I can focus on the timeline piece. Since the transition was announced, I think it was November of 2023. So we're now 2 years down the track. There's not a great deal of. I was just looking at the Verra registry here because I don't have the exact numbers, but there's not a great deal of projects that are actually issued under this methodology. Yeah, it's just when I look at it, it's under development, under validation, pretty much. How is this actually being realized in the real world, essentially? Because the jump from
Yeah.
the old methodologies to the new methodologies just, we're not seeing the traction. How do we get higher
It's
throughput,
been a
essentially?
massive undertaking. You're about to see traction because a
Hmm.
number of jurisdictions have just had final data released. So
Okay.
Verra has been working on releasing the data that's required for the new methodology over the last year plus. And that's quite an undertaking, right? It's basically undertaking accounting at a full jurisdictional scale, baselining for an entire jurisdiction,
Hmm.
and for any jurisdiction where there are relevant projects. So it was a massive undertaking. And it's taken some time with a completely brand new process and a complete new set of approaches that was needed in terms of being able to implement this new approach to get to producing that final data in a way that is rigorous and usable by projects. So
Hmm.
there are a number of projects that are waiting for that, right? And they're waiting for outcomes. They're waiting to be able to verify their outcomes under the new methodology and need that data. So, I noticed they just posted the Peru final data this week, I think, right? So that means projects in Peru will now be able to use the new data and actually go ahead with validation. Sorry, it was sort of revalidation under the new methodology, but really verification and issuance
Yeah.
for vintages that fall within that.
Okay.
So I think we're about to see a number of issuances that are actually applying the new methodology, but until now it's been a bit of a waiting game to have that final data ready.
Okay. And that's going to come in essentially on a country by country basis, depending on that data becoming available to those developers. So
Yeah.
so I guess then two questions that kind of stem from that, which is, do you think that the market in terms of the buy side will be there to actually receive these types of credits? Do you think that there's appetite? And from your conversations as an independent consultant with folks in this space, whether climate startups, NGOs, folks in the MBS space, investors, etc., looking at this, what's your take there?
I think we're still in a challenging environment,
Hmm.
predominantly because these credits aren't yet on the market, right? So it's a bit tough to call how they're going to land, and I think that
Yeah.
a lot of the demand is going to depend on that. The one thing that I can say is that the methodology is ICVCM approved, and I think that helps a lot.
Yes.
Um, and it is being recognized for some bilateral agreements under 6.2 as well, right, with Singapore, for
Hmm.
example, which I think also gives it a nod of credibility. But there is going to be a lot of scrutiny as those first credits come out, right? And I think that that's going to matter quite a lot. And this runs into all the uncertainty that we just talked about before in terms of where this market is at. And I think this is, these things often get conflated. But in reality, the whole status of the voluntary market or the verified market, as people preferably calling it these days,
Yeah. I'm a
especially
bigger
given
fan
the
on that side.
overlap with compliance,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
are there's just a lot of uncertainty over what companies are supposed to do with these credits in
Hmm.
a reputable way that has the right words around how they're using them in their
Claims
overall
to substantiate,
strategy.
etc.
Exactly. And so I think that and we're seeing more and more what South Pole coined as green hushing
Hmm.
that's happening with companies continuing a lot of their commitments, but just not really talking about it. So I think it makes it more difficult to really understand where the demand lies and how much we're going to see that return because so many companies are being very quiet about what they're doing. I think that there has been generally positive reception to the new approach, and there's been the endorsement of ICBCM, et cetera, that I think there's a lot of potential for this to help revitalize the market for red credits. And there are new avenues as well for demand, right? So we do have the opportunity under 6.2 of leveraging that. And there are some relationships and agreements between Singapore and other countries where this will be able to help facilitate some of those trades. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves. And I think the more and more clarity that we have around, with SBT, et cetera, read within the new SBT guidance is not entirely clear to me, although
Hmm.
I think it does in some way potentially fit within this overall emissions responsibility um, component and potentially the finance component. What they call it, direct action, I think. And so, how these different components come together and if that's actually helping companies have more clarity over how to use the units, I think will help. But you also asked about jurisdictional, and I think
Yeah.
it's relevant to the demand question, right? Because there is also movement and a new coalition around jurisdictional REDD trying to promote that in the market. And I think it's going to remain a really core element that both project and jurisdictional activities exist, right? Governments are good at setting policy sometimes. Governments are able to put in place certain activities that they can control, whether that's through various incentives, through tax incentives, et cetera. But they're not generally good at being on the ground addressing drivers in a specific place, right? And so we need the project activities in order to drive finance to very site-specific locations. So I'm hopeful that or really trying to press the importance that we don't lose the project aspect as a part of this greater push and endorsement of jurisdictional approaches. And if
Hmm.
that can be done well, then all the work that's going into promoting jurisdictional approaches, provided you have these projects nested that are part of a jurisdiction, which is accounting and reporting on REDD, then we may also be able to see an improvement around the demand side of this with high integrity use of credits that are well incorporated at a project level in a jurisdictional approach, as well as at that jurisdictional scale.
Yeah. And then you get the complementarity as well of the nimbleness of private capital and private companies. And then that backstop of the governments as well. So you get that complementarity of public and private. I think
Exactly.
I think that I subscribe to that thesis as well. I see it as a transition essentially of the project-based learnings and this market really being this innovation engine, leveraging all these technologies to actually drive and address the questions that have really sort of affected and throttled that buyer confidence, which is this focus on integrity and making sure that the data is resonant and it's verifiable and it's totally visible and there's confidence in that, which then hopefully begets confidence to participate again to support the market. And then if that then can also be layered into the jurisdictional approaches, then you can get a scale at a government and then intergovernmental level. So I do subscribe to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to remember that though we now are sort of seeing these as verified markets rather than voluntary because the same units can be used in multiple market instruments now, the core, the inception of this market was to be innovative,
Hmm.
to create new ways of mitigating climate change, and to drive finance that went beyond regulation, right? And sort of with a goal of almost, as you say, being a transition mechanism to having a better regulatory environment that was actually addressing the issues. I don't think we're actually there yet, right? We don't
Yeah.
have sufficient regulation, sufficient demand, sufficient commitments that this is actually all operating in a regulatory system. I hope someday we get there. But even then, there will probably be new activities that make sense to still be bubbling up from this historically voluntary space, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I agree with this sort of transitionary mechanism. And at the same time, I want to be careful to not imply that there's sort of an end date to project level activity. I don't think
Yes.
that's the case. In
I don't think so
reality,
either. Yeah. Even though
site-specific
we'd set out maybe
activity.
originally to do that, right? It was just a stopgap effectively until governments got their act together. But it's been 20 something years plus.
Well, and this is mixing different things, right? I'm talking about site level versus jurisdictional scale activity, not
Sure.
necessarily like regulatory versus voluntary, right?
Hmm.
And I think, the more and more we can get towards stronger regulation, the better. That is the longer term solution, right? But that's not going to negate the need for actors to be implementing project level activities in given places, particularly where you have a high deforestation threat. There's only so much that can be resolved through regulation. And so I think that component of it, until all deforestation is illegal, which of course we still need forest products. So I don't know that the world gets to that point or not, right? But at the same time, there will always be, I think, these activities that can be better achieved, better outcomes, easier financing mechanisms, et cetera, at a site scale rather than a jurisdictional scale. And these things can work together.
Yeah. Great. So I guess where to next in terms of this conversation, because you're giving me a masterclass here. I'm curious to get your take on, well, actually, maybe if I can rewind. Yesterday when we spoke just briefly prior to obviously jumping onto the pod, you mentioned around consensus building and the fact of the world just being really highly fragmented politically and also in certain camps. And when I look at carbon, it's certainly there's a lot of fragmentation in our space, but oftentimes we forget to focus on areas where there is consensus, right? And consensus building is really important. Can you maybe give me some thoughts on some areas where there is broad consensus? And then maybe let's then pick some outliers and focus on some contentious issues to try to find a middle ground.
Yeah, I mean, I find this market interesting, right? And I think almost every impact focused space, somehow when we try to do good in the world, all of a sudden we're held to an even higher standard than those doing bad in the world.
Hmm.
Um, And it seems to be something that just comes with the territory, right? As soon as you're
Yeah.
trying to achieve a good outcome, then somehow it also has to be a perfect outcome.
It's the
And I think
perfection
that,
paradox in the Kaplan paradoxes that
oh, don't get
Rene
me
Steve.
started on that one. Yeah. But at the same time, I think that we're constantly sort of battling over things where we should be aligned, right? I think we are very much aligned, across the whole sector that we need to address the climate change as an issue, that requires every strategy possible, that we need not only removals, but also we need to protect standing forests. And then the devil is in the details of that, right? And and yet instead of focusing on the things where we are aligned, we tend to focus on the minutia of the differences and end up preventing progress, right?
Mhm.
And I think a really good example of this is the permanence debate that really has come up in the lead up into COP and into the COP process itself. And there's this rules that were set out through around permanence. And when they ran the consultation on them, I don't remember the numbers. It was something like 90% of comments were in opposition of the rule. I don't remember the actual percentage, so don't quote me on that. But and the debate is really coming down to this idea of, yes, what is permanence? And obviously we want to try to create permanent solutions to the climate. And if we're looking at what is the scientific definition of permanence, is frankly the wrong question, right? What the thing that we need is to make sure that these activities that result in mitigation outcomes are as permanent as possible, yes, but most importantly, are usable and have an impact on the climate in the near term. And why do I say the near term rather than the long term? Because we are approaching all these tipping points, right?
Mhm.
So if you ask only the scientific question, what is a scientific definition of permanence? Then sure, you're going to get to something that's like 1,000 years, and it's this perpetual monitoring. But is that actually what we need right now? And this is where the conversation breaks down. Even though we all agree we need to make sure that there is durability to these credits, right? That we're not just reversing something, that we don't pay for something one year and the next year it's gone, right? And yes, that is a threat when we're talking about nature-based solutions. But we also have approaches where that can be mitigated through buffer mechanisms, through insurance mechanisms, through other ways of making sure that a unit might be replaceable if it's lost. And
Mhm.
so it's a great example of, like, we all generally agree that the credits need to be permanent. And yet we end up infighting over things that are based on either ideology or a challenge of what question it is we're asking. And I think we all need to always come back to and remind ourselves, what is the outcome that we need and when do we need that outcome? We don't know what we're going to need 1,000 years from now, but we've either solved this or humanity doesn't exist at that far of a time scale, right? It's a ludicrous time scale to be looking at when we have planetary tipping points in front of us in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm talking about multiple things at once here, right? The
No,
debate around permanence, but I'm also really talking about where I think we are falling apart as a sector and what goes wrong within the negotiating halls, which is forgetting what is the most important next step, right? And how we can coordinate and cooperate on a set of outcomes where the majority of people, I'm not putting the significant number of oil company lobbyists in attendance into this bucket, but most others, agreeing on what we need, breaks apart over this minutia that is, camps who get incredibly into the weeds of one specific issue and cannot pick up their eyes and see the forest for the trees, right?
very apt metaphor. Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a really sobering and really mature way of looking at it, right? Because it's what is needed. And from a risk mitigation kind of hierarchy, we need to look at all of these options, but prioritize the ones that can actually deliver the scale in that shorter term, as you said, in order to allay the worst effects of what we're already baking into the physics of this system. So I guess that's a sort of a transition then into integrity versus scale, right? You've talked about the ICVCM essentially as this governance framework and the eligibility. You mentioned VM48 being approved under that framework, and also you referenced the corporate net zero under the SBTI updated and currently up for comments section, and ultimately a lot of this has been driven by this internal focus on ensuring integrity, right? And even that transition from the old methodologies to VM48 is driven in large part to that. You've effectively alluded to in that monologue around this focus on durability and permanence and longer dated removals, effectively, where a lot of the investment has gone into over the certainly last 2 years in the market. But yet to date, the scale of what's actually been yielded from many of these approaches, and I'm looking at direct air capture, I'm looking at enhanced rock weathering and other nascent methodologies, just because of the technology curve, they're effectively not yet yielded the supply that's ultimately necessary. So there seems to be a lot of money invested at the front end of that technology curve, and yet we have other solutions that, whilst imperfect and maybe not having that length of durability effectively, aren't seeing the necessary investments, and it keeps coming back to nature, right? So how do you contrast essentially this paradox around integrity and then ultimately focusing on what is needed, which is deployment of capital at scale and ultimately these mitigation outcomes
Yeah.
at scale?
I think what's interesting, right, and from my skeptical hat, if I can wear it for a moment, is just that those that want to invest in the technology around, removals, particularly when we're talking about industrial removals, are those who understand that kind of finance. They understand how to make a business out of that kind of activity, and the benefit is going to flow back to a corporate, an investment firm, whatever, who has invested in building that facility. When we're talking about forests, and we want to reward the people who are protecting the forest, it flows to poor people in developing countries. So, I mean, there's some element, I think, of just what does finance understand? How does it want to gain from all of this? That, like, frankly, it doesn't necessarily make sense to a lot of people that money can and should flow to people who are protecting forests around the world. And then it's very easy to attack an ecosystem because ecosystems are dynamic, they are changing, they are hard to measure. A measurement today, shifts because of seasonality, and all of the complexity that goes into a dynamic ecosystem is hard to comprehend from an investment perspective compared to an industrial facility that you can put a meter on in terms of what it's doing or not doing, right? So some of that is realities of how we measure things, and some of it, if I'm being a bit whatever the word is that I keep looking for and can't find, a skeptic of who's financing the activities and what they ultimately care about, which frankly, much of finance that's going into carbon markets, of course, is as a market mechanism still looking for a return, and that return is clearer to them. And so it's easy to say, oh, it's the permanence is the problem, and the lack of clarity of the accounting is the problem. I'm not entirely sure that's really the main or the only thing that's going on here. And then it's very easy to point at those issues and then say, well, this means it's not going to work and therefore it can't scale, right? But again, I come back to this issue around clarity, because without clarity, companies are left not knowing what to do. And so even those who do want to engage with this market, who want to deal with their ongoing emissions while aiming towards some net zero or other long-term target, are unable to have, at this point, still clarity over what to invest in, how to incorporate that in their strategies. And so I think we end up, circling this debate of what's holding us back. Oh, it must be this thing, it must be that thing. And I'm not suggesting that we don't need high integrity. We need as much integrity as we can. But at this point, especially giving planetary tipping points and the timeline for those, we need to be pushing as much as we can into it, as fast as we can, that helps achieve these goals. And when we lose standing forests, they are irreplaceable, right? This is not just build another widget and it replaces the prior widget, right? These are, again, dynamic ecosystems with species that we can't just bring back from the brink. So in my view, we continue to just fight the same fights over and over that prevent the scaling. And a lot of
Hmm.
what is needed is to say, this market is imperfect. We're doing the best that we can and accept that it's always going to get better and better. And I think, if nothing else, REDD is a good example of how something was developed. The mechanism has driven a significant amount of finance to real action on the ground. And there's even an admission on that from recent, reporters and critics, right? That some
Yeah.
of these projects are doing really good work and have suffered from the criticism. And I think
And
as
the
a
retreat from
sector
the
that
corporate support of who are the buy side, who just were not going
exactly,
to support it whilst there's being criticized for taking voluntary action.
and fair enough, right?
Yeah,
So
and who would have thought?
but and yet, at the same time, like that's media's job. Media should
Yeah.
scrutinize, right? Science should scrutinize. Like these are healthy aspects of a market. It is
Hmm.
healthy to inspect something and say, is this working? But in every other market, we just see continuous improvement without throwing out the entire market, right? If I look at the capability of the computer that I'm using today versus the capability of a computer from 20 years ago,
Massive
obviously
difference.
the specs and the how fast it is and how much data I can store and the things that I can do with it have advanced massively. And I'm not using the old one anymore, but I didn't go, sue Apple because my new computer is stronger than my old one, right? It's an imperfect analogy, but the more that we can accept that science is going to keep getting better, the data is
Hmm.
going to keep getting better. We're going to keep learning what works and what doesn't work and incorporate those things over time without saying everything that came before was worthless, the more that we would have the potential to scale, right?
Yeah. No, definitely. That's a very, very solid summary there. I just kept thinking you were looking for a word, and I'm thinking you're trying to place yourself somewhere in between pessimist and optimist, and I think that you're probably more close to the sort of a constructive pragmatist, effectively understanding the flaws and constraints that currently underlie this market that is imperfect, but we're still aiming for better outcomes, and you definitely are doing that on a day to day. As we kind of round out the time that we have together, Naomi, just I guess maybe sort of you've given us, really masterclass on Red Plus and the evolution of that market, jurisdictional Red, talked about integrity and scale. Can I ask what are you looking ahead to in 2026, and what's the sort of the type of work that excites you?
Hmm. Yeah. I think we're going to see continued progress, momentum around jurisdictional scale RED,
Hmm.
hopefully also continuing incorporating projects within that. But I think we're going to continue to see a lot more diversity, right? More, you look at like EUDR and what's happening more on supply chains. I think there's more and more emphasis on multiple mechanisms that can drive finance, and that's beyond just red, right? But within the whole market, things like green bonds, things like debt swaps, looking at a bit on Article 6, particularly 6.2. I think 6.4 remains challenging for another few years of getting everything through that process, having the methodology approves, getting projects through. So I'm,
Hmm.
a bit skeptical of the timeline on progress of that one. But at the end of the day, I think 2026, maybe even another year or two after that, we continue to have a lot of um, lack of clarity, a lot of disruption, a lot of like, trying to get from point A to point B of a market that is ready to scale, where the mechanisms are in place to do so, the clarity is in place to do so, but with a lot of concrete progress towards that, right? Like, I think we will see a lot of shift over the next few years to a market that is actually workable and is
Hmm.
continuing to drive finance. And some of that's going to be carbon credits, and some of that's going to be finance counted in a different way, and some of that's going to be different incentive structures. And
Sort of like
that's
contribution claims, things like that, of that nature.
well, I mean, it's part of the whole SBT framework now, right?
Mm.
This whole direct action thing, which can be measured in finance. So, there are those mechanisms as well as things like regulatory policies, zero deforestation, supply chain approaches, things like that, that are not necessarily credit based and yet are driving incentives towards better forest protection and other climate mitigation that might be operating in ways that are not necessarily carbon markets, which doesn't mean that those are unable to scale at the same time.
Yeah.
I just think we're going to see a few more years that are a bit continuing this sort of lack of clarity
Hmm.
until we slowly get more coalescence around what are workable strategies and how corporates should engage with this market.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think there's still a lot of that turbulence to kind of borrow a metaphor from the airline industry. Uh, but I do think that we'll land it nonetheless. Just I guess in terms of optimism, what are areas that you're optimistic about? It seems to me from the trading side and certainly from conversations that we have with clients on both buy and sell side that there are certain pockets in this market that are still really resonant and resilient effectively. And I'm looking specifically at nature-based removals who seem to have as a sort of a category a renaissance. And I'm thinking around the VM47 methodology for afforestation, reforestation, and regeneration, and equivalent ones across the different standards, but also blue carbon, IFM, and others. There seems to be a lot more investment going into those project types on the forward curve. Are you seeing that in terms of your work, and do you feel any sense of optimism with regards to that category at all?
I do. It comes with a lot of chagrin, for a lack of a better word, right? I think
Hmm.
it's wonderful that we're seeing scaled finance for those activities, and yet it's often coming at the cost of not financing forest protection. And, that's entirely influenced by the fact that the removals have counted towards an SBT target ultimately, or can be used in some proportion where that hasn't been recognized for REDD. And in terms of what's the most important for the climate, they are both essential, right? And
Hmm.
so, yeah, at the same time, yes, I think that's a really dynamic sector. There's a lot happening there. I think we'll continue to see a lot happening there. We're starting to see a lot on the blue carbon, peatlands, other, blue carbon opportunities that are becoming, more interesting to folks, and certainly on the reforestation restoration side of things, and soil carbon, and lots of different, farm-based efforts. Very dynamic, definitely over the next year.
Hmm. Yeah, cool. And any last words before we wrap? Just conscious of your time.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think it's an interesting, space. It has remained a challenging one to move forward and to get to that scale. And I think, more and more of my attention is focused on the human side of this, and,
Hmm.
how we can better engage as a sector, how we can better engage as leaders within a system meant to drive impact. And how do we do that from a more intentional view? And so, yeah, we'll have some interesting evolution there for myself personally, but also I think something that's really important for all of us to just continuously remember that that the humanity is kind of the essential element of all of this, right? Otherwise, what's the
Yeah.
point of fixing climate change? So, yeah, the more that we can sort of focus on those elements where we agree and focus on the thing that's most important in front of us in terms of outcomes in the short term, and to prevent these tipping points to the extent that we can. Yeah, that's really my core message these days.
Awesome. Well, Naomi, I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for that masterclass. You're welcome to come back and join us any time. Want to thank the audience for tuning in and listening. And if you like that episode, just click like and subscribe. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Renee. Bye bye.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Naomi. Really appreciate you.